Hi there, and welcome to this video that I'm doing on spotting an argument and looking where it emerges. Okay, so the question that we've got here is, why were there so many revolutions in Europe in 1848 to 1849? Now, this is not my essay. Must kind of put my hands up to that one now. This comes from academia.edu. So it's I can't claim this as my work, but we're in conversations at the moment. But anyway, what I'm looking at here, the writer has created a clear line of argument. So let's have a look at the introduction. And when we've gone through the introduction, I want to show you where the line of argument then appears in the essay, and we're going to go through and highlight that as well. And when we do, you can start to see a kind of a continuity emerge between the argument and the evidence and discussion within each paragraph that supports the original statement in the argument. And what we've got to do is make sure that the things we're saying throughout the essay are consistent with the original point that we said we were trying to argue in the first place. So let's read the intro. The revolutions of 1848 to 49 were a chain of political uprisings in Europe, which is by far the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history, with revolutions experienced in the majority of European nations and regions. In general, the revolutions were limited in their organisation, led by coalitions of the working classes and the bourgeoisie that fell apart rapidly, and led to tens of thousands of deaths. Significant social and cultural change resulted, but minimal political change was instigated, leading many historians to deem the revolutions as failure. Now that's your context. That's your kind of your picture of what we're talking about and where we're starting. The next bit's really important because this is the argument. This bit actually addresses the question. The reasons why so many revolutions occurred in 1848 to 49 can be split into three sections: economic discontent, political discontent, and the ideological remnants of the Napoleonic era. And so here I will be explaining each reason and analysing it, so on and so forth. So the writer here has identified three key reasons. Okay? So now let's look at the first paragraph. And the first paragraph is clearly based around the idea of economics. An economic depression in Europe was affecting the continent throughout the 1840s, but in 1848 it hit a breaking point. Three factors were fueling an economic depression: population, unemployment, and food crises. So this is what I would call relevant context, relevant contextual knowledge. A rapidly growing population was leading to unemployment, and there was a food crisis all across Europe, which was even further exacerbated by poor harvests during the mid-1840s. The population in France alone saw an increase of 27.8 from 1800 to 1841, which, with Germany, Italy, and Austria all areas that experienced uprisings also see similar increases. Mitchell, 1980, with such unprecedented population increases, the governments at the time simply could not and would not alleviate the problems that soon started arising. All across Europe, populations rose, but this is not alone. This is not alone to explain why the revolutions occurred. So here we've got a really quite sophisticated thing that the writer has done. Let me just highlight that and show you. Okay, so what's the writer done here? The writer has given us a lot of evidence here to suggest that population was causing things to reach high levels of tension in Europe. Now, by the time he's got to this paragraph here, we know that population is a significant factor. He's cited statistics. He's looked at particular countries. He's looked at France, Germany, Italy, Austria, showing us that it's not isolated. And a population increase in 40 years of nearly a third in France. Well, something's got to give there, really, hasn't it? However, because he's said up here in his argument that there were three culprits, by the time he gets down to here, if he'd have turned out and said it's all to do with population, then the argument becomes weaker because he's contradicting what he said up here in the introduction. So all across Europe, populations rose, but this alone cannot explain why the revolutions of 1848-49 occurred. With rising populations, we can see a substantial rise in unemployment, with industrialisation failing to provide sufficient jobs. In France, the textile, construction and engineering industries were hit particularly badly. So we get lots of nice statistics there. And so he's suggesting that there was a significant rise in unemployment. So what he's saying there is that yes, there was a rise in population, but obviously there isn't a rise in economic activity to match the level of population. And so you need those two things to run hand in hand. And there you go. Okay. So here we have, it's not hard to see why many revolted against such precarious conditions. A European subsistence crisis also hit Europe in the mid-1840s, producing excess mortality and suffering caused by the potato blight. Belgium alone experienced an 87% drop in the potato yield, decreasing to 50% the following year. A 50% potato yield was experienced between 1845 and 47. So now we move on to the second reason. So again, the writer has started the next paragraph, and this is a simple yet useful strategy to bring the reader back to the idea that we are going through each point, and that we are now on to a second reason, and that there were, as we remember, 3 reasons that we listed in the introduction. No nation in Europe at this time. A second reason as to why Europe experienced revolutions in 1848-49 was because of political discontent throughout the whole of the continent. No nation in Europe at this time employed significant democratic tools and governance. So there were very weak democracies, if any at all, across the continent. Most were autocratic regimes. And the governance at the time was hardly consensual with the public. With the increasing presence of a middle-class bourgeoisie came an increasing demand for greater political power to be devolved in the form of votes and powerful legislatures and a more restricted monarchy, but these were never granted. So here, actually, the writer has reminded us about essentially fundamental tensions that exist within Europe. Discontent with the monarchy was very common throughout Europe, with France showing a special hatred of their rulers in the lead up to the revolution of 1848. Okay. Now we go into looking at specific case studies, and we look at specific countries, and the picture of France, for example, is supported by evidence and a kind of a case study here. Let's move down to look at the question of Italy. The Habsburg Empire employed feudalism throughout its lands, and serfdom was utterly abhorred by the peasants who felt their rights were being extremely restricted. Press censorship, the banning of liberal university professors, and the banning of nationalist fraternities were all key parts of the oppressive Carlsbad decrees of 1819. That led to great discontent that could be easily set off into revolution. Sicily saw great discontent with its political setup, with Ferdinand, the Sicilian king, abolishing probably the most liberal constitution of Europe immediately on return. So that paragraph there quite neatly addresses the question of political. We've done economic, and now we're on to political causes. The prospect of a constitutional monarchy, bicameral legislature, and an independent judiciary were all wiped out, all of which promised to help alleviate the previous uprisings as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. Now let's move on to the bit on the subject of ideology. So the writer now is addressing the third thing that he said he was going to address. Finally, we see that the ideological remnants of the Napoleonic era were proving incredibly popular with the public, which had implications that utterly endangered the European governmental setup. Ideas such as liberalism, democracy, nationalism, socialism emerged during the Age of Enlightenment and gathered popularity as alternatives to the current systems employed, and this proved sufficient enough to encourage the European population to revolt, with many explicitly basing their demands around these ideologies. Very neatly and succinctly explained. Liberalism emerged in response to the arbitrary suspension of rights, such as with the July Ordinances in France and the Karlsbad decrees in Austria, and the abolishing of the 1812 Constitution in Sicily. So, when we get to the conclusion, so that I don't want to go deep into looking at the entirety of the kind of the ideological argument. So the conclusion here, if this essay has been done in a kind of a coherent way, which I think it has, if we look at the conclusion here, it should, by rights, address the question. So let's go back, look at the question, look at the line of argument here. The reasons why so many revolutions occurred in Europe in 1848 to 49 can be split into three sections: economic discontent, political discontent, and the ideological remnants in the Napoleonic era. We know each paragraph does that. So let's have a look at this. The reasons as to why Europe experienced so many revolutions in 1848 to 49 can therefore be neatly separated into these three categories: economic discontent, political discontent, and the ideological remnants of the Napoleonic era. Economic discontent was fueled by an ever-growing population that led to widespread unemployment and famines. A political discontent emerged as a result of the increasingly influential bourgeoisie and working classes demanding greater power and intervention from their governments. Finally, the ideological remnants of the Napoleonic era, themselves emerging during the Age of Enlightenment, inspired many to act for change. So what the writer has done in that conclusion is that they have skillfully interlinked and interrelated the factors. No factor can actually be seen in isolation from one another, because human societies don't really work like that. So finally, the ideological remnants of the Napoleonic era themselves emerging during the Age of Enlightenment inspired many to act for change. Liberalism, democracy, nationalism, socialism were just some of the ideologies that many of the rebels based their demands on, and it is a combination of these three causes that led to a widespread revolutionary wave throughout Europe in 1848. Now this is let's just get rid of that red for a moment. Silly thing. Hold on a tick. Let's get rid of that. Let's just look at this last line. This last bit of the essay is very succinct, and it addresses the question very succinctly. Liberalism, democracy, nationalism, socialism are just some of the ideologies that many of the rebels based their demands on, and it's a combination of these three causes that led to a widespread revolutionary wave throughout Europe in 1848 to 49. So really, you could package the essay really into the introduction and that little bit at the end, which match, and they provide along with all the evidence in the middle, and it provides a coherent argument that addresses the question. So that's what we're really trying to do, a coherent argument that addresses the question. Essays aren't big, long tracts of telling facts. They are kind of a coherent selection of facts that are appropriate to what it is that the question is actually asking. Anyway, I hope that's useful, and I'll catch you on the next video.